Hey folks, welcome to Lawfare Live. It is Tuesday, January 7th, an unusual time. It's 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And no, we are not here to talk about Trump trials and tribulations because there are no more Trump trials, and the tribulations are all on the part of the people that were trying to try him. We may have something to say about that later in the week, or we may not. We are here to talk about something entirely different. And that is the announcement this morning by Mr. Mark Zuckerberg of substantial changes to Facebook's content moderation processes. And I can't imagine a better group to slap together in a few texts to talk about this. Joining us are Renee DiResta of Georgetown, the Knight Institute at Georgetown, and Kate Klonick, and Quinta Jurecic, uh, Daphne Keller joining us from the other coast, and of course, Dave Willner. This group of people collectively has a more interesting background and things to say about this subject than just about any other five people I could imagine. So rather than trying to introduce them individually, I'm going to say when I call on you each, just say a little bit about what your background in this field is. Some of you are very well known to Lawfare listeners, particularly Quinta, but some are relatively new to the ecosystem, and so people will actually benefit from knowing a little bit about your backgrounds in this space. So, Renee, who is, by the way, as of today, one of Lawfare's newest contributing editors, welcome to
Thank
uh,
you.
the the Lawfare Greater Cinematic Universe. And get us started. What did Mark Zuckerberg announce today, and why do we care?
Yes. So for the listeners, I've been a guest a couple times in my prior role at Stanford Internet Observatory. We talked about what happened there. I am now at Georgetown. I'm actually at the McCourt School of Public Policy, and this came up today because somebody reached out to me saying, "Hey, Zuckerberg is referencing this speech he gave at Georgetown in defense of free speech." So let's just use that as the bridge to dive right in. So this was a kind of a very brief address. You can watch it on Instagram, or you can go to the Meta website and read the text that announced a bunch of significant changes to content moderation policies across Facebook, Instagram, Threads that are framed as focusing on enhancing free speech and reducing moderation errors. So that's the framing. So this kind of specifics that he articulated was a transition to community-based moderation. So the creation of a community notes project. This is something that is, that X has done. He kind of points to X as one of the reasons for doing this. But what he says alongside that, big point too, is that he's killing the fact checking program. So in the United States. So X is no longer going to have this fact checking program where third party journalists go and kind of append fact checks to particular content. Usually this shows up as a label or an interstitial. So that program is going to be gone and replaced by a community notes program. He also mentioned several other things. He talks about, and this was kind of surprising to me, sort of a high rate of false positives in their moderation tools that moderate user comments. So, what some of us call like the AI mods that just kind of crawl the platform. Basically, they're just sort of observing content on the platform. And this is where people will sometimes have a comment get taken down. He says these are both prone to errors and overreach. And also, the policies that they're applying are overbroad. So he makes some very specific references to gender and gender policies and to immigration. Um, then we get, in addition to all of this, there's going to be a relocation of the moderation teams. So whatever sort of central moderation remains is going to be moved to Texas to avoid the appearance of bias that came from having those teams in California. Then we get into policy enforcement adjustments, like sort of shifting severity and rethinking what should be enforced upon and how. And then finally, there's a whole section on intersection with governments. So he points to what he refers to as sort of secret courts in Latin America. This, of course, is a reference to Brazil and its content moderation travails with X. And he basically says that under the administration of President Trump, he hopes that the US government will help Meta to fight for free speech all around the world. And so that, roughly speaking, I think summarizes the 5 or 6 major sort of policy shifts that were announced in this, 2-minute live.
All right. So I want to focus a little bit on the why we care question. Normally, and Kate, get us started on this. Normally, w- uh, we wouldn't leap to do, a big company changes content moderation practice. You wouldn't leap to do a live discussion about that. It happens pretty frequently, actually. Sometimes they tighten them, sometimes they loosen them. Why are people, including us, by doing this conversation, freighting this set of changes with such potential meaning?
Thanks, Ben. Kate Klonick, and I have been on Lawfare a bunch of times, but I am a professor of law at St. John's University Law School, and I specialize in internet law and online speech governance. So that's a great question. I think that the reason this is so significant is because it is a huge sea change from the approach that all of the tech platforms have basically been taking since 2016, which has been to ramp up trust and safety and to ramp up kind of online governance, to fight mis and disinformation, to kind of create safer environments for against hate speech, harassment, bullying, to try to end election fraud, all things that kind of came out of the 2016, 2018, 2020 elections. And now all of a sudden you're seeing kind of this big change from like one of the biggest platforms, basically from Meta. And this is also following in the footsteps of X. So I think that that's a huge thing here. Basically, when Elon Musk took over X, took over Twitter and formed X, he took it private and he decided that he was going to just crater this huge cost center, which was the trust and safety teams. He was going to kind of just get rid of it, not going to put any effort into this. And we don't know whether it's working really, actually, is like really important here because it's now a private company. So they could just be like, it could just be a money pit for billionaires, like all of his investors and the people who backed him that could just be like, this could not have been successful at all as a business strategy. But he's kept with it. And he has done it on principled reasons. And now we have seen a political shift that is kind of catching up with this, that everyone has seen over the past kind of 4 months, 2.5 months in particular, in which there is kind of this huge technocratic billionaire meeting of the minds with Trump and the right and this buying into this idea of censorship. And so you simultaneously have, I guess this announcement is an announcement that like it's not just that the government is going to be going in this direction, but all of your private platforms are going in this direction also. And they're doing so in the auspices of kind of a principled stance of freedom of expression, but really because it serves their bottom lines quite well. And also because it is politically expedient to do so in the moment. And I think I'll just flag really quickly before I stop I think something that was really important, super important in how Zuckerberg chose his words and what he spoke about, far more important than like we're getting rid of fact checking or whatever, was the fact that he was like the best way to like stand for free speech right now is to align with the US government in like this fight for global freedom of expression. And so we're teaming up with the US government to fight freedom of it is, I mean, that is bonkers. That is bonkers kind of rhetoric. And it kind of goes to show this idea that has been in the ecospheres for a long time, since 2006, Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu's book, Who Controls the Internet, which predicted that essentially the internet would become a power vacuum and a new frontier for war and national security and geopolitical conflict that would be fought over by three main parties, Europe, China, and the US. And that was like literally what Zuckerberg said today was happening. And so, so that's kind of like, that's like, why is all of this so important? Because all of this has been brewing quietly for experts for a long time, and now it's bubbling to the surface and it's unavoidable, and we're watching it happen in real time. And so I don't think anyone on this particular panel is like color me surprised, but it is something to kind of all of a sudden, it's one thing when when all of us tell other people, journalists who call us, this is what we see happening and this is what's going to happen someday, and then it happens. And so it's kind of that this is the moment.
So, Daphne, one person who was asked about this today was Donald Trump, and the clip is a little bit of a weird one. He says he thinks Facebook has come a long way, and a journalist asks him, "Do you think this is in response to your threats?" And he says something like, "Yeah, probably." And so I'm curious, do you read that as just a sort of offhand Trump comment, or should we see that as like, I guess we get to jawbone now? How do you understand Trump's reaction to this?
Well, I think it can be both. So introduction, I'm Daphne Keller. I run the program on platform regulation at Stanford, and my work is mostly about platform regulation, obviously, and First Amendment limits, including those to protect users' rights on the internet. And I think I will get back to your question, Ben. I'm working toward it. We had a long period of people freaking out about platform power over speech appropriately, right? Like the biggest platforms exercise tremendous power over public discourse, but the sort of semi-hidden thing behind that people often didn't notice is, and then there's whoever has leverage to get platforms to do what they want. And that could be advertisers getting platforms to set the speech rules that advertisers prefer. That could be foreign governments getting platforms to set the speech rules that foreign governments prefer. It can be our government getting platforms to set the speech rules that government prefers. And that layer of, oh, wait, there are other powers here, and particularly state power, government power, was kind of slow to emerge. But it's almost like today's announcement was just like the big, broad caricature version of pointing out that problem and signaling platform kowtowing to, in this case, the Trump administration. You know, did this happen because Trump threatened them? I mean, almost certainly, right? If you're a rational economic actor and you don't want negative consequences coming from government, it might be a purely rational business choice to accommodate state power and do what they want. So whether or not, Donald Trump himself sees this as his influence, it seems like as a purely rational matter, his influence is very much at work. And as Kate said, the idea that having a private company partner with the government on setting speech rules is a win for the First Amendment is bonkers. That's not how the First Amendment works.
All right. So that sets up this next question very well, Quinta. How much of this is the freak out that we're seeing about this is because this is another billionaire adjusting policies to please Donald Trump and dressing in this very weirdly kind of new masculine way to appear like one of the bros who pleases Trump. How much of it is that, and how much of it is that the policy changes themselves actually are significant, or is it both?
I think it's both. So in terms of the political context, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look at this from 40,000 feet. Trump's comment about, yeah, maybe that's why they're doing this, I think was very telling. Oh, I just realized I didn't introduce myself. Sorry. I'm Quinta. I'm a senior editor here. I've been thinking about platforms and Trump and democracy since everyone started freaking out about it in 2016. All right, back to my point. I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look at this from a really high altitude because the details are extremely important. And I think I'm really interested in everyone's thoughts on just how this is going to play out and what it's going to look like. But I also think that often when people try to sort of analyze like Trump era social and political dynamics, it's really easy to miss the forest for the trees. And here I think the forest really matters. And what I mean by that is that the way that I read this is as part of a broader shift in a certain set of Silicon Valley toward a hard right, sort of techno futurist populism that is aligned with what Trump happens to be selling at this current moment. And is certainly, I think it's not a coincidence at all that Zuckerberg sets himself up as kind of following in Musk's footsteps, so to speak, because Musk is definitely the most prominent standard bearer of that. And so when you see this, I think, in a lot of the ways that Zuckerberg is talking about what it is that he's doing, not just the fact of the rollout, but the language he uses around it. Because if he had just come out there and said, you know, hi, everyone, we've decided we're going to make some changes to our content moderation systems. Here's the rollout. I think that we might not be having this conversation, or perhaps we would, but it would have a very different tenor. And instead, he uses this language where he says the recent elections felt like a cultural tipping point toward prioritizing speech. There's sort of this language of, you know, we're listening to the people in a way that felt to me very much like this kind of idea that, you know, Trump's second election speaks to a cultural shift. He uses this line, we're in a new era now, that I think really aligns with that as well. And I think that kind of suggests what this is going to be. You know, there's a version of this where maybe it's, you know, totally neutral, totally apolitical implementation. I think they kind of tip their hand in the language that they're using. And you see this, for example, there's been some reporting on some of the rollouts of these policies to the Transparency Center on Meta. And so in their hateful conduct policy, there is a line that says, and I'm just going to read it because, again, the language is really important. We do allow allegations of mental illness or abnormality when based on gender or sexual orientation, given political and religious discourse about transgenderism and homosexuality. So, again, without context, that might sound fine. I think that specific phrase, transgenderism, is something that's really used by the political right, and often by sort of trans exclusionary folks who don't believe that transgender identity is real. And I think that, you know, if you read that without the sort of corporate language filter, what they're saying is that they're not going to get mad anymore if you say that people who identify as trans are mentally ill. And so I think that it's telling that that is one of the examples that they're putting forward as like, yeah, okay, you can say this on our platform now. And that speaks to the kind of the cultural shift that Zuckerberg is speaking to. Now, I think there's a separate question about whether or not this cultural shift actually exists or whether it's kind of being manifested into existence, so to speak, right? Zuckerberg's using this language that really aligns with this idea of a kind of a Trump mandate sweeping into power, you know, the great man on the horse, the figure of history, and Zuckerberg's going along with him. But he won by an incredibly narrow margin in a year with strong anti-incumbent sentiment. And so I think that there's a real question in my mind of whether or not Meta sticks to these policies once we start seeing the kind of thermostatic shift in public opinion you would expect, and that we saw last time in the first Trump administration. As soon as Trump got into office, started doing things that were unpopular, his popularity plunged. Democrats took the House in the midterms, and the rest is history. And there's reason to suggest just because of political gravity, the same thing would happen. So I'm going to be really interested to see to what extent this is like a genuine commitment held by Mark Zuckerberg and his new, you know, World Wrestling Federation get up, and to what extent it's just it's trying to, you know, follow which way the wind is blowing, and then whether Facebook changes, or excuse me, Meta changes direction when the wind starts blowing a different direction.
All right. So with that, Dave, let's dive into precisely what they did here. And you helped start the content moderation program at Facebook, lo those many years ago. Um, how much of this is undoing work that you did, and how much of it is undoing work that was done later, and what are they seeking to replace it with?
Yeah, so it's this. So first, hi folks, I'm Dave Willner. I was a very early content moderator at Facebook, and then founded the team that wrote a lot of the initial content policies, which are still the core of a lot of what they do today. Was a fellow at the Cyber Policy Center with Daphne and Renee, and now have co-founded a small startup that's trying to use language models to do text labeling. Kind of an aside for this conversation. To me, this whole announcement is both more and less than it appears. It's some of the parts of it are very significant and a pretty big deal and really do change the way things have been done. Some of the parts of it, I think, are potentially sort of nothing at all or really very overstated. And so those are some of the things that have gotten the most traction. So in my time there, we didn't do a ton of the sort of proactive removal that Renee talked about, frankly, because we didn't have the technology to do it very well. And the sort of announcement does frame the company's historic removals as focused on illegal content. That's true-ish. But of course, the proactive attempts to remove content also always included things like porn and spam, which are broadly not illegal. And I will say I will eat my messenger bag if they stop trying to proactively remove porn. I don't think that's going to happen. So there's a little bit of sort of hand waving there and how that's even framed. But it is a pretty big deal that they are moving back from sort of proactively attempting to detect and remove, particularly, I think, hate speech is sort of the subtext of a lot of what they're talking about here. They invested a lot in that sort of post Cambridge Analytica, post Trump 1. That was after I had left, but they really did lean into, we'll solve all of this through proactive removal. Don't worry, there won't be any false positives. It's totally going to work great. And so you can read this, if you're sort of willing to read the announcement in good faith, as on some level, like, never mind, that totally failed and didn't work, and our precision is terrible. Oops. Part of it. And I do think that dialing back is potentially very significant, particularly in sort of smaller and more private spaces, where if they're relying on user reports to detect potential violations, insofar as potential violations remain, you're not going to hear about them in groups where folks are aligned around those interests because people don't report things they agree with to a first approximation. So
in other words,
is
if you have
a big deal.
Group organized around we hate X type of people, you're not going to get complaints from that group about hate speech directed at X type of people.
I mean, people are real dumb, so I'm sure it'll happen sometimes, but less likely. But then on the flip side, they made a lot of hay of sort of, oh, we're worried about bias. We're moving all these content moderation teams to other places. As far as I've been able to figure out, that is mostly fake. The content moderation operations teams were substantially already in Texas, in the US, and that's been true for so long that I helped set them up. So it is very not new, like 15 years ago, not new, that there is content moderation operations substantially done in Texas. And if you read carefully how he talks about that, they talk about moving the operations teams more centrally to Texas and the policy setting apparatus outside of California, but not to Texas, which I think is sort of subtextual for centralizing a bunch of that in DC under Joel Kaplan, who's the sort of newly promoted head of all of public policy and moderation there. But again, there was already substantial staff in DC working on that stuff. So a lot of those changes to me feel very much like pure sort of pandering to the people currently in charge. That said, the automation changes could have some really significant impacts.
All right. So who wants to explain community notes to me? Everybody starts by every freak out that I've read has started with, he's getting rid of, well, I'm replacing it with community notes. How do we think community notes is going to handle this problem? And nobody stops to explain to me what a community note is, or what problems, how it works, or whether it can solve what sort of problems or not. So who wants to explain community notes?
I can take that on. I can be the explainer there. I was pretty active on community notes in election 2022, looking at community notes as a means by which people were trying to annotate political speech as it was going by. I was very interested in it because one of the things, as we've been talking about this, there's a lack of legitimacy in content moderation. It's a bit of a legitimacy crisis. Everybody in every group, everywhere in the world, we might be able to say, hates some aspect of content moderation, right? They have their posts taken down, they're irritated by it, something gets throttled, they don't get the engagement they think they deserve. So there's a lot of very personal feelings about content moderation. So community notes started, it was under the name Birdwatch at Twitter. And it started as this is the pre-Elon days. It started as a way to try to solicit effectively the wisdom of the crowds to add more context or correct tweets that were wrong. So there was at the time a fact-checking program, and then there was also this other thing. And the other thing, if I saw, let's say I saw a tweet go by and I thought like, hey, that's not true, I could go and I could create a community note, and people who were also participants in the community notes program could vote on it. And one of the things that community notes relies on is what's known as the bridging algorithm. And the bridging algorithm, just to simplify it, is basically saying that a community note will be appended to a tweet if a sufficient number of people on opposite sides of the political spectrum, as the platform determines that, right? You're not declaring yourself a Democrat or Republican to join, but as the platform kind of intuits your distance from other people in the note voting community, if a certain number of people across the spectrum agree that a note is good, then the note appears on the content. So what do you when you are a voter, right? So let's say I write the note and all of you are going to go vote on it. You see a little interstitial and a little interface, and it's got a bunch of radio buttons, and you can say like, checkboxes, and you can say things like, I think the sources are good. I think this is presented without a lot of emotion. This is, add something to the discourse. This tweet deserves a note. It's not just a matter of opinion where we're all going to go like brigade some random guy for his bad opinion. So that's the principle of community notes. And it was sort of envisioned as a complement to fact checking. I think that it is a really great complement to fact checking, actually. Like, I'm very, very supportive of community notes because it gives users agency, right? It lets all of us participate in that process. It enhances legitimacy. It's not just like some news outlet I may or may not trust saying this thing is or is not true. It's all of us coming together to kind of collectively decide. But it has some problems. So it's slow. Right. So in order for that bridging algorithm to decide that a certain number of us have agreed that this is worth going up, a certain number of us have to do that voting, right? Then the question of who even goes and writes the note, like what kind of content attracts the sort of people who want to go write notes, that sometimes means that not all topics are going to be touched upon. Then you're going to have areas where significant degrees of polarization mean that not enough people are going to agree. So even if the note is written, it's not going to appear. And so you have this kind of, there's some evidence that it can be gamed during politically heated issues. So all in, you just have some problems with speed, with the kind of volume it addresses, and then with the kind of political valence of what it chooses to go after. So again, I think great as a compliment. And what I was more upset by when I read the announcement, what I thought was like, wow, this sucks, was that he kind of threw the fact checkers under the bus, making these vague allegations of bias, and then said, so we're going to have community notes because it's working so great on X. And the fact is, we really don't have very much data about how well it is actually working on X. If you think the point is to add context and create a much more broadly informed user base, we just have very, very little visibility into how well it's actually working.
Who has thoughts on whether this is a plausible model? I mean, how well were the fact checkers working really? And to what extent is this plausible, not, as Renee says, not as a complement to, but instead of what the fact checkers were doing?
So a little of this depends not just on the individual community notes or fact checks, but also how they use them as signals in their broader decision making or feed ranking, right? Like, we can argue about how much fact checking or other kinds of signaling that something might not be accurate affect the views of the individual people who encounter that content. The more interesting thing to me is whether or not they're keeping track of sort of repeat offenders and potentially slowing down or deranking them in feed. My guess from the sort of way the note is written is that they are not going to be doing that, or probably are moving away from that. There was some language about sort of being more careful about demoting things in feeds. And I would say, I mean, it's disputable, but to me, the bigger impact of the fact checking program isn't actually the individual fact checks. It was the sort of broader accrual of negative reputational signals for repeat transgressors. And if that's not happening here,
Go ahead, Quinta.
One thing that this brings up for me is, and I'm curious what the rest of you think about this, the kind of uh, political signaling of a community notes type project versus the fact checking program. So I've seen some reporting based on the various organizations that were involved in the fact checking, basically saying we had no heads up about this. We thought everything was going great. Like, news to us that Meta was unhappy with what we were doing. But a lot of them are, journalistic organizations, or, organizations that have some kind of affiliation with or affinity for sort of very traditional journalistic values. And this is at a time when this sort of right populist wave has been very successful in positioning more traditional journalism as a sort of something aligned with, the elites you can't trust. And Musk certainly has been very successful with that. That line on Twitter, he keeps saying, you're the news now. And I think the shift from Birdwatch to community notes, part of the way I read that was, you're in control now, right? Not those eggheads, not the journalists, not those egg-headed content moderators who, of course, are not, that's the class dynamics of content moderation are a separate conversation. But there is this sense of, like, we're giving power back to you. You are the people who get to choose, whether or not this is a good post or something that deserves a correction. And that is kind of in line with this same political valence. And so I will be very curious to see to what extent Meta kind of adopts that, or to what extent this is, to some of the points that other folks have made, really just a kind of pandering pasted on top of a genuinely different approach.
Yeah, as Dave melodically summarized before we started, feelings don't care about your facts. So all right, I want to turn to some of the more international dimensions of this in a second, but before I do, I got to tell you, I was I spend as much time on Meta products as the next guy, I think, but I wasn't really aware that there was robust fact checking going on Meta. And so I'm a little bit surprised today to see all these people coming out of the woodwork to say they're shocked by the end of this fact checking. I can't remember the last time I saw a post on Meta that was like somebody had flagged and this is wrong, this is untrue. You get sometimes a flag, but Daphne or Kate, just help me out here. What was the nature of the program that was curtailed today? Because it's pretty invisible to me.
I think Daphne should go, but I was just going to say that my main take on what you're saying, and this also goes to Dave's point about the like, why does he mention that we're moving things to Austin when basically Austin is already the hub of so many things? It's
Center of
because
conservative life, Austin,
well,
Texas.
right. No, that is what it is. This is literally Zuckerberg like denouncing the California elite, like the West
Right,
Coast thing, and
but
and
come
making a
on,
political.
Kate. Denouncing the West Coast elite and saying we're going to Austin is like, I mean, that's like, it's
I
as
think
tone
he
deaf. I
said
mean, maybe,
Texas. That was left
He
ambiguous.
did
I'm
just
pretty
say
sure he just says
Texas.
Texas.
He
I'm
just
pretty
said
sure
Texas.
I'm pretty sure Austin is more liberal than like San Jose, where the current
yeah.
California
Well,
operations are.
Austin has a very I mean, we don't need to get into like kind of, but I do think that this is like a huge signaling move. He made a huge announcement that he's like we have this. That is what he was saying. He was like, listen, the tides are changing. We've gotten the message. We're moving things to Texas. That's who's going to be judging your. Texas is going to be controlling your internet like moderation now,
Yeah.
not
Ken Paxton. It'll be
California.
wonderful.
Like, I mean, but I mean, literally, that's exactly what he said. So, like to your point of like, and I guess kind of we're kind of discussing the chat, so I'll just kind of bring it up. But like, what does Meta get out of this? Like, why are they announcing all of this? Why are they bringing it up? And like, why did he do this? And I think he's playing catch up with Elon. I
Okay.
think that yeah. Go ahead.
So it'll surprise you all, but Zuckerberg didn't, in fact, call me for my advice on before he did this. But had he done so, I would have said, dude, there's nothing in this for you. Um, you're going to buy yourself a world of hurt with the EU, who's, saying, we want things to be smaller and, we want more regulatory check-ins about every jot and tittle of, you know, markets and facts. And so what you're saying is we're getting out of that business. That seems like a thumb in the eye of all kinds of European regulators. You're doing it in an explicitly nationalist fashion, which is also going to irk, all those secret courts in Latin America. And so you're buying yourself a lot of international pain in order to be a pale shadow of Elon Musk, with whom you can never compete on that basis. Um, what am I missing, Daphne? What is in this for him?
So the initial set of posts indicated made it sound like he wants US help in fighting EU censors and fighting the secret Latin American courts, which is not a totally implausible thing. When the US executive branch throws its weight around in Brussels, it can make a difference. But like, I don't think enforcement of EU content moderation laws is the biggest pocketbook issue for Meta right now. And it's interesting that the post talked about censorship and deterring innovation. I can well imagine what that means is the GDPR, like laws that are actually being enforced against Meta in ways that actually threaten its bottom line. Maybe that is more desirable. But then backing off a little bit, it's like, can you really bargain with this administration? Do you really think you're going to get what you want just because you put it in a post? And maybe everybody knows that, including Mark. And maybe the bottom line is this is just saying, please don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. Like, I'm making this big show of surrender. I don't know what these chits are going to get me. It depends how you might try to hurt me down the line. But, I'm building up some credit out of fear, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the entire announcement struck me as sort of a confession of weakness more than anything else. I think it's being received on a lot of parts of the internet as this sort of scary threat to safety online. And it feels to me much more like a weak move. And it's subtle, but particularly loud in there. He calls out the EU and Latin America and China, and there is not a single mention of India in there, despite the fact that India engages in just a ton of government-led takedown requests and jawboning. But India is sort of Trump aligned, so of course they don't get mentioned. It just feels like a much less. It's framed as a defiance of the liberal elite or whatever, but in a lot of ways it feels much less defiant than the sort of statements you would have gotten from Meta in like 2015.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, there's what's really striking about it to me is how short-sighted it is. And in two different ways. So the first way is Daphne, to your point about this as a kind of like, please don't hurt me, please don't hurt me. It amazes me that, everyone got the advice in dealing with bullies on the playground that you can't back down in front of a bully because then the bully will just go after you more. And yet no one seems capable of implementing that advice in the face of the incoming administration. You want to bow down and, claim fealty to Donald Trump, sure, go ahead. That will not get you any points with him. I can tell you what's going to happen. He's going to continue, exacting, asking for more and more and more from you, and complaining whenever something happens that he doesn't like, and you will end up more and more and more in his pocket. And so, in terms of thinking about, the long-term future of the company, this seems very odd to me in terms of how it's positioning itself. And then the other thing is that, and I mentioned this before, I think it assumes a level of stability and durability to Trump and to the sort of Republican alliance, such that it is, that I just don't think is there. Like I said, there's a very, very narrow majority. There's an extremely narrow majority in the House. I think, the sort of rules of political gravity are that the president's party almost always loses the midterm elections. When, a Democratic Congress comes in and starts holding a bunch of hearings about what Meta did and to, help out the Trump White House, how are they going to respond? It just doesn't seem to me like this is particularly well thought through. And so in that way, maybe magnifies, Daphne, your point about, please don't hurt me, please don't hurt me. Like it's kind of like this instinctive response that is being presented maybe because of the kind of, macho posturing on Zuckerberg's part as, a brave new step into a brave new world, but just doesn't seem like there's a lot of thought put into how that's going to play out over the long run.
So I'm going to be the one that kind of goes and disagrees with a little bit of what was said, which is one, I do think
I'll
that
add a community note.
Okay. Well, now we've bridged everything, so it'll show up. But basically, I think that there is something to what Dave said about the weakness and what Quinta is saying about how this doesn't really make sense as a long-term strategy. And then I see completely how it makes sense as a long-term strategy. What the EU has been kind of this game of chicken that the EU has been playing with not even a game of chicken. It's kind of over. They've just regulated the heck out of them, the tech companies, and the tech companies not knowing how much they're going to push back. Well, now they have the backing of the entire US government on this kind of very, this American first and this free speech first kind of this backing. They've made it not just an economic or business issue, but about freedom of expression globally. They've also done that with China. This positions them really well economically for the things that they want, which is entry into China in some way for both like preserving manufacturing out of China and chip manufacturing, and then two, like trying to get access into the ad and like speech markets in China, which they also would really kind of like in some type of way or justify in some type of way. And so I think that like in a long-term position, if Trump's out of office in 4 years, he's out of office in 4 years, and everyone will forget this pivot. They're just doing what they needed to do in the moment. And for right now, this buys them a lot of power for long-term geopolitical positioning for things that are going to be 5 or 6 years down the road from now, not just like when Trump is done in God, it can't happen soon enough, but 2028. And so I think that there's that. And then the other thing that I just was going to say really quickly was just super interesting to Dave's point. I also thought that Zuckerberg looked like weird and manufactured and weak. And I had a friend who used to work for the Trump White House message me and literally say, like, did you see Zuckerberg? Doesn't he look great? He looks so healthy and strong. He looks fantastic right now. Like, this is just like the most reasonable, like, how could he be upset about this? This is the most reasonable thing he could have said. He's just meeting America in the middle. And I was like, wow, like truly echo chamber, truly like I am carrying around my priors as I watch these videos, and I'm like can't escape them. But I do think that that's like an important thing to surface here, that like not everyone is seeing this as we're seeing it, and like this is, you know, this is makes a lot more sense if you're not concerned about the politics of this and you're not really that principled, you're just using principles to advance an economic position.
I would say one other thing that we haven't really talked about though is the perception of content moderation, the perception of the legitimacy of any action a platform can take is now so wholly skewed on political lines. I mean, a lot of us work in tech policy on this call, on this Zoom, and you know, we've seen the debates over like CDA 230 over the years. We've seen the job owning cases, the must carry laws. I mean, it's a complete alternate universe, if you will, in which like the facts are not the same. When you actually get into, you know, I spent a lot of time today fielding inquiries from people who do not do this all day long, saying like, well, isn't it true that fact checking works, or isn't it true that fact checking doesn't work? And you know, you go to like really, you know, you go to like the academic papers and you have to sort of like try to synthesize across them, and who was this one funded by, what was the means by which this was done, was this based on transparency data, was there some privileged access, is this like a you know, a simulation in a lab somewhere? It's really hard to actually have a sense of the actual efficacy of these things. It is, nobody on the outside has any sense of whether it's working or not, except when it touches them personally and they can say like, you know, my comment got taken down. Look at this stupid, you know, look at the stupid auto mod getting mad at me for using this word when I didn't even mean it to be a slur or mean or what have you. And that sort of like context piece is just kind of garbagey. And so I think in this case, you know, by taking this action, he doesn't even have to, you know, one thing that was sort of funny is that if you look at Facebook's comments on the fact checking program, I sort of went back and was reviewing some of their past blog posts. They're like wildly positive about the program, even as people in civil society are like, no, that's just a fig leaf. Like there was somebody who asked like, how many fact checks does the entire fact checking apparatus complete in a day? And as we were all sort of going through these papers, the best answer somebody could come up with was 17, right? Which is like minute. It's tiny. And is that accurate? I have no idea. Nobody knows, you know. We don't know. And so this question of like, does it actually do anything? Like what is this program? Was it effective? Was it impactful? We just have no idea. And so there's so much that is kept from us, the users. Even the most informed users who work in this field don't really have an understanding of what's going on. So he effectively gets to like make a change, do something that placates a political problem for him, that gives the Republicans a win. You know, we saw him do this with Jim Jordan, that ridiculous letter a couple months back. And so that's how I read it. It is essentially like, you know, giving up nothing to get a win. And now we get to see what the actual impact of that program really was in the natural experiment that's about to happen.
All right. There's been this thread running through this whole conversation, which is Dave says it comes off as a real expression of weakness. Kate says her friend watches it and says, wow, he looks so strong. And so, you know, there's a real kind of masculinity projection going on. And of course, there's some pretty explicit gender politics in it. So I want to surface this whole question of strength versus weakness. And I have two components to the question. The first, semi-humorous. The second, deadly serious. Daphne, what's up with the chain?
What is up with the chain? So to me, it read as fake tough guy. Someone said in the comments, it looks like tech bro Buddhist, you know, it signals mean different things to different people.
But he's clearly trying to project something, right?
He's clearly trying to project something. I mean, what it reminds me of is all of the sort of like posturing that Elon Musk has engaged with against the other strongmen of the world who he feels threatened by or needs to show he's bigger than. So he had like his posturing against Thierry Breton of the European Commission. He had his posturing against the Supreme Court Justice Moraes in Brazil. You know, there's this sort of like men demonstrating their power through their social media posts vibe going on right now. And I do think it fits into that.
Yeah, so the other side of it is actually a question that came up in the chat on the YouTube stream of this, which I want to direct to anybody who has data on what the answer might be, which is is Facebook in fact, and Meta in fact, in a position of weakness? Um, uh, on the one hand, TikTok has kind of cleaned Instagram's clock in the Reels business. On the other hand, Instagram may be banned later this month. Um, uh, Facebook, I can't really tell who still uses it, but it seems to be geriatrics like me. And uh, what is and of course, the whole idea that we were all going to put on goggles and experience the world virtually in 3 dimensions um, doesn't seem to have materialized. So what do we know about Facebook's actual position as it looks at its competitive landscape right now? Is it in fact in a position of weakness?
Worth clarifying, when I say weakness, I don't necessarily mean financial weakness. I mean independence vis-a-vis government
No,
actors,
no, no, no.
which is a
I
little
understand.
different.
I'm
Yeah.
explicitly broadening your
Yeah.
question, right? The
Yeah.
action makes a lot more sense if they think they need a protective shield from from government in their interactions overseas. If they think then if they're feeling strong and capable and uh pretty independent, right, then you might reasonably take a much more adversarial posture toward government. But that don't hurt me posture does have this vibe of, that they feel vulnerable to something.
I mean, I will go ahead and sorry, Quinta, you can jump in. Just quick. I don't think they're particularly vulnerable. They're incredibly powerful right now. But they are not complete. Like they have a different set of products than all of the other companies. And what I mean by that is that they are primarily they are much more consumer facing in the nitty gritty than like Google is, for example. Like people personally are like very personally involved in things on Meta and Facebook, and how they are like putting up things on Instagram or what they can see or what they can't see. They're much, much larger than Twitter or X. And then like TikTok is completely different because of China and everything else. And we could do a whole other episode on the regulation stuff that's coming with that, or lack thereof. But I think that the main thing is that like they have plenty of what they don't have is like a diversification of like both like hardware and software. They do not have kind of like the same type of diversification that like Microsoft does or a lot of the other or even Google. And so I'm kind of curious as to how that kind of plays here and what people are thinking, but I am not and it is not my impression that they are seen as weak in so much, except in so much as that like maybe people in elite circles don't like or use Facebook Blue very much, and think that it's kind of a passe kind of thing for geriatrics.
What do you think, Renee? Is Facebook, as strong as the muscle shirt and the chain project, or are
What could
they
possibly be that strong?
the curled up in a fetal position, don't hurt me vibe is the real Facebook?
No, I mean, what Kate's describing is accurate. And also, one thing to note is that these policy changes were announced specific to the US. So even as Meta's market share on Blue might be declining, or might, the user base might be less active in the US, and I don't have that in front of me right now. Um, the changes that he's making are applying within the US context, but not particularly broadly outside of the US. There's some interesting signal in that too, right? It really does reinforce this question of like, maybe not wanting to kill your fact checking in other parts of the world, particularly given catastrophes like what happened in Myanmar, right? Or areas where the government is the problem, right? And you want to have the support for free expression of journalism and things on those platforms. So it is a little bit of a divide. One thing I'll say, just there's a lot of groups on Facebook. I think people who are not active participants in groups culture particularly normie groups, right? Like the mom groups are all there. The the buy sell trade groups are there. The neighborhood groups. Like this is the place that people still go because they've been there for so long, and because it is still like the place that everybody is. So when you want to find, you move to a new neighborhood, you can go join that app, or you can go and find a
And I
Facebook
will
group.
say, though, to your point, Renee, it's not just the communities, but like that is a defining feature of Facebook that does not cross over into geographic things. Like,
No.
you're completely correct. I think you're just like you're dead right. There is, and that is, it is a big platform that allows you to form small communities, and TikTok doesn't let you do that.
Right, and for like, even just the fact that Marketplace is thriving again, it's this place that people go to for more like local stuff, right? I think that it is Nextdoor never really became the thing that people went to because Facebook was where everybody already was. And so that DNA I think continues, even if people are not so much posting pictures of their baby every day or putting their like I ate a sandwich statuses up or whatever it was that we all did 20 years ago. It's still there. And so I do think um that in fact, in some ways, one of the ways that moderation touches people personally that they find creepy is actually that the auto mods read the private groups too, right? Read the secret groups. So you are getting moderated. I'm in a couple of these like science groups that I've been in for ages. And occasionally someone will share a link like, look at this bullshit, and then the auto mods will be like on them, this is misinformation, right? And so there's just a lack of sophistication, and everybody I think has had that experience that participates in group culture where someone will post to the group, hey, I just got moderated, hey, I got a ban, et cetera, et cetera. And it just reinforces that sense of like, this is not the way we want it to be.
All right. We have 4 minutes left, which means we have time for each of you, starting with Daphne, to tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 how concerned you are about this in the broad scheme of the future of social media, content moderation, information health, and ecosystem accuracy.
I'm pretty concerned. I'm gonna give it a 7, not because of the changes announced today, but because of the signal about the amount of kowtowing that might be happening in the future. And it's not just a signal to Trump, like as much as it's presented as a like this is the US versus the world, Modi would like that kind of kowtowing. Lots of people would like that kind of kowtowing, and now they know it's available.
All right. Renee, are you over, under, or under the 7?
I think I was about to say 7 also. I think 7 is about right, maybe 6. Again, from that standpoint of, is it like the be all end all and the misinformation debate as it's called sometimes? No, I think that I don't think that fact checking was really doing a whole lot to to address that particular source of concern. But again, overall, as Daphne mentions, I think I think it's what was signaled today that I found most troubling.
Kate, are they
I'm gonna
being
go.
alarmist, or are they
No,
underselling the threat?
no, I think they're underselling it a little. I'm gonna go with 8.3.
8.3.
And so like
That sounds more
uh,
like a Richter scale.
I knew you were gonna say Richter. I like read it and like but no, I think that I actually think the fact that Trump, I almost said Trump, the fact that Zuckerberg was willing to go and make this announcement today, um it just signaled to me something. I mean, I completely agree with Renee. I don't think that I don't think that the fact checking ending is here nor there. I don't think that moving to Texas is here. It was everything that was being signaled by saying the words "we're moving to Texas." Like we like I discussed, it's everything that's being signaled by being like, "We're not going to fact check you anymore." Okay, they were like doing 17 posts. That doesn't matter. It is like the performance of like a new era of is kind of like the bending the knee that other people will want to. And here's the bigger thing that makes me kind of go to the 8.3 is that I don't have the slightest idea how to undo this. There has been kind of this discussion about how do you decouple these billionaires from this government. Like, I don't know how to start moving them further away from each other. And antitrust had been floated for a long time. I still don't think antitrust is at all the answer for this. But like, I don't have a clue about how you stop a person like Elon Musk from just like paying his way through the entire world. And I don't know that like we've ever kind of encountered a situation like that of such massive wealth and private power.
Quinta, will you go higher than 8.3?
No, I'm gonna say, I don't know, 6.5, but only because I'm worried about so many other things right now that it's a sliding scale. Um, I do think that there are a lot of things to be worried about right now. This is certainly one of them. But I think viewing it in context of a sort of larger environment, which is how I've sort of trying to look at it right now, it strikes me as in the medium realm. But maybe I'm totally wrong. We'll find
Yeah,
out.
well, we're all underestimating some threat and overestimating others. So it's just a question of which threat we're doing that with. Dave, you get the last word. What's the right answer on the threat Richter scale here?
This is, I think maybe a little bit surprising, but I'm going to go even lower. I'm going to say like a 5.5. Not because I don't think it's very bad, but because I think most of our actions don't really matter very much.
It's the ultimate LOL, nothing
Yeah,
matters.
yeah. I like to me what this inaugurates is an era of a lot of twisting in the wind. And this point came up earlier. That like I think we're going to see this rush in one direction, and we're going to see a rush back in another direction, and we're moving from an era of kind of consistent platform policies over time to like really wild swings. Kate likes to call me a content moderation nihilist. I think that's maybe right here. I don't think it's going to have a ton of difference.
Yeah, if you, as Kierkegaard wrote, if you moderate content, you will regret it. If you don't moderate content, you will regret it.
And
If
everyone will be mad no matter what.
and if you offend the users, you will regret it. And if you don't offend the users, you will regret it. We are going to leave it there, folks, because if we end this live stream, we will regret it. And if we don't end this live stream, we will regret it. Thank you, Dave Willner, Quinta Jurecic, Kate Klonick, Renee DiResta, and Daphne Keller for joining us. And thanks to our intrepid producer, Anna Hickey, who, as always, makes all of the Lawfare Lives run